One thing both sides in the independence debate agree on is that next year's referendum will be the biggest political decision Scotland has faced in more than 300 years.
Sticking with defence, can I ask you about, for instance, the Royal Navy? Does HMS Glasgow and HMS Edinburgh join a new Scottish Navy, while HMS London and HMS Westminster stay with the English Navy? How does that division happen in practical terms? And the same would apply to the RAF or the Army.
Well, of course, negotiation over defence assets, and rather interestingly, the recent paper from the Ministry of Defence that was released in the last week or so actually conceded for the first time that there would be a proper negotiation over defence assets, because just as Scotland is entitled to a share of the assets of the former state, we'll have to take into account the liabilities of the former state as well. But it's interesting you should talk about surface ships. I mean, one of our arguments in terms of defence policy is, despite the fact that Scotland is very much a maritime nation, there is no major surface ship stationed anywhere near Scotland at the present moment.
Would you envisage
defence policy in Scotland at the present moment is we have lots of things that we don't need, like nuclear weapons, and the things that we do need, like major surface ships, are stationed somewhere in the south of England.
So would you envisage, as it were, a division of the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force, with some aircraft and some ships remaining in Scotland and some remaining in England? Is that how it would work? Or would you start again with a completely new defence force?
Well, it's very likely there'd be assets which would be negotiated, which would go to the Scottish Defence Force. But these things are done in coordination. Nothing surprising. It doesn't mean that the Royal Navy doesn't continue. It just means that some of the assets would be appropriate to go to the Scottish Defence Force. And we'll be outlining our detailed plans on that very, very shortly indeed. But can I just point out to you, Andrew, that Scotland right now has...
I'm sorry, to be clear, we would be talking about two navies and two air forces.
Well, Scotland would have its own defence force. That defence force would act in cooperation with our friends and allies as part of the NATO alliance. And one of these friends and allies would be our friends and neighbours in England. But of course, when we come to Scotland becoming independent, then you rightly say that some of the assets of the current defence forces would fall to the Scottish Defence Force, some of the assets that are appropriate. I was merely about to point out that after the extraordinary defence cuts which have fallen on Scotland over the last decade or so, Scotland has planned only to have one Air Force base left in Scotland and one naval base left in Scotland. So we're starting from a very low position in terms of assets in Scotland at the present moment. But the Scottish Defence Force will have forces appropriate to a country of just over 5 million people as part of the NATO alliance, as many other countries defend themselves adequately and properly, and incidentally without possessing weapons of mass destruction.
And you talk about assets, but it's the same with people, presumably. If I was an RAF pilot of Scottish origins, I would expect, presumably, to go back to Scotland, and there would be a new flight based at Lossiemouth or wherever. But this would be a division of the Royal Air Force into two separate air forces. I just want to be clear about that.
Well, it would be a Scottish Defence Force, Andrew. But I mean, you know, as I'm sure you do know, that there's people in the forces at the present moment, I think, and I'll check this, but I think from 23 nationalities at the present moment. You know, there's many people from a variety of nationalities, mostly Commonwealth countries, who serve in the armed forces. And again, in the defence paper, I think the point was made that people would have a choice as to which forces they wanted to serve in. But we'll put forward a defence force appropriate for an independent country, and that defence force will have a non-nuclear basis, but it will be an adequate defence force to protect Scotland and to cooperate with our friends and allies. On defence capability, then we will have a Scottish Defence Force. Currently, Scotland contributes in monetary terms, in the balance sheet terms, around £3.2 billion to the UK defence budget. The amount that's actually spent surrounding Scotland or in Scotland or on procurement in Scotland is about £1.8 billion. We propose a defence budget for the Scottish Defence Force of £2.5 billion, which is the European average of defence expenditure in terms of GDP. And for that, looking at other comparable nations, then we'll have a defence force which is realistic and proper for Scotland's size and contribution it makes to international organisations like NATO, for example. Fastlane will be an independent Scotland's naval base, although a configuration of conventional ships of a variety of kinds, looking at the particularly important strategic job of patrolling the Western Atlantic approaches. That's what Fastlane will be doing. What Fastlane won't be doing is harbouring Europe's biggest concentration of weapons of mass destruction. I've recently argued that an independent Scotland should have a written constitution. In my view, that constitution should include safeguards on the circumstances under which we'll commit our armed forces to theatres of conflict, such as the requirement, for example, that military action should be in accordance with the United Nations Charter. Although Scotland cannot use the example of our power, we can use the power of our example.